All right. I believe we're recording. Let me figure out how to. Okay. All right. I think we're ready. So hello, everybody, and welcome. Um, my name is Aaron Essery. I'm the State Extension Specialist for Viticulture and Enology at Oklahoma State University. And today we're going to talk about malolactic fermentation. This is a big one. We're just going to take it slow, slide by slide, and just chug through it. So here we go. Malolactic fermentation. First of all, what is it? Malolactic fermentation is the conversion of malic acid into lactic acid via lactic acid bacteria. Some people say malolactic bacteria. That's actually kind of incorrect. The proper name is lactic acid bacteria. But anyway, malolactic fermentation, also shorthand MLF, gives wines a softer, rounder mouthfeel. And the conversion is malic acid, which is crisp, think of a Granny Smith apple, into lactic acid, which is creamy, think of butter or milk. So that's essentially malolactic fermentation. It's the conversion of crisp malic acid into soft, buttery, a type of acid. And we'll just keep going along. So here's kind of just a breakdown of the chemical compound. Malic acid, and then lactic acid bacteria catalyzes this reaction and turns it into lactic acid. And diacetyl also is a byproduct. We'll get into that too. Diacetyl is a chemical compound as well, but diacetyl is produced during malolactic fermentation. Just some more shorthand diagrams. Again, this is a very quick explanation, but essentially you have lemon zest and apple and crisps, malic acid, and then you have butter, cream, oil, lactic acid. So that's the conversion. There's a lot more to it than that, but and that's what we'll dive into this webinar now. But that's essentially what's going on in your wines when they go through malolactic fermentation. So for malolactic fermentation to take place, malic acid must be present in the wine. It's a precursor. So MLF is the conversion of malic acid into lactic acid. Therefore, malic acid must be present. Now, I say this because in warm and in hot growing regions, such as the South, Oklahoma, Texas, there's malic acid tends to deplenish longer in the growing season. So the longer you wait to harvest, the less malic acid you have in hot growing regions. In cooler growing regions, such as Washington, Oregon, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, malic acid is usually retained because it's a cooler growing season. Now, I've never lived up north. I've never grown up north, but this is kind of what happens and what goes on. So that's why I say malic acid must be present. If you have a late harvest in a hot growing region, you probably have very little malic acid, and you might not get as much lactic acid as you'd like. So anyway, if no malic acid is present, there's not going to be any malolactic fermentation. Malic acid has to be present in the wine. Specifically L-malic acid. L-malic acid is the organic acid. I believe D is synthetic, but that's just here or there. Just know you need L. Anyway, so you're thinking, how do I measure malic acid though? How do I know my grapes have malic acid? Well, really high performance liquid chromatography is probably your best bet. And I know if you're just making wine in industry, you're like, what? That's the best bet. There's no easy way to measure malic acid. You can also use malic acid enzyme color strips. You can buy these and use them in industry. But the thing with malic acid, these enzyme color strips, is that they usually max out at 500 milligrams per liter, which is not a lot. That's you need 3-4 grams per liter, maybe more, 5 grams per liter of malic acid to really get a good malolactic fermentation. So these test strips, they measure out at 0.5 gram a liter. You see, so malic acid test strips can tell you there's malic acid present, but if you have over 500 milligrams, you don't know how much you really have. So there's no easy way to measure malic acid, but again, MLF goes on all the time. A lot of people do it. A lot of people don't even know they're doing it. If you have malic acid in your grapes, which all of them really sort of do, but it just varies. Colder growing regions have more malic acid. Hotter, warmer growing regions have less malic acid. And to give you a number, if you have 2 grams a liter of malic acid, that's about the cutoff. I say that you can do, you can take it through MLF if you want, but 2 grams a liter is not a lot of malic acid. 3, 4, 5 is better. Anyway, that's just by the numbers. So this is going to be a dense lecture. So we'll just keep going. So diacetyl. Talked about malic acid, lactic acid. Now we're talking about diacetyl. I pronounce it. Some people may say diacetyl acid, diacetyl acid, however you pronounce it. But diacetyl is the chemical compound associated with butteriness. So if you've ever had like a creamy Chardonnay that's just a butter bomb, it was loaded with diacetyl. It is a byproduct of MLF. So the lactic acid bacteria produce diacetyl just during this malolactic fermentation. It's a byproduct. So the timing of malolactic inoculation will determine how much diacetyl is actually produced as well as bacteria strains and things like that. But if you co-inoculate, so I'm sure we're all familiar with alcoholic fermentation. That's the conversion of sugar into alcohol. That's fermentation. If you co-inoculate for malolactic fermentation with alcohol fermentation, you'll get less diacetyl. Just the way the microbes interact with one another, the way things churn inside a tank. So initiating MLF after primary fermentation usually results in more diacetyl acid. And again, bacteria strains make a difference. There's some strains produce more diacetyl, some strains produce less diacetyl. So if you want more diacetyl, if you want more butter, select a strain that states that, it's a high diacetyl production. And then also longer ML fermentations. So the longer you drag out malolactic fermentation, usually the more diacetyl is produced as well. So these are just some tidbits. Bacteria strain makes a difference. Longer ML fermentation, and then initiating MLF after primary fermentation will increase your diacetyl production. Again, just to restate, if you want more diacetyl, if you want lots of diacetyl, if you want lots of butter in your wine, initiate after primary fermentation, drag out ML fermentation as long as you can, and we'll talk about that later too. And then bacteria strain, select a bacteria strain that has high diacetyl production. And then avoid lees contact while undergoing MLF. Lees is the dregs that, lees is the stuff that falls to the bottom of the tank. Avoid as much contact as you can with that as well. So when does MLF occur? Okay, this, what we're talking about, when does this go on? So malolactic fermentation can occur naturally in the wine, especially after primary fermentation. It'll happen by itself. There's microbes present everywhere all the time. So it can induce itself unknowingly if you don't watch it. MLF can also be induced. You can actually inoculate for MLF as you do, for alcoholic fermentation. You can go after alcoholic fermentation or during. You can inoculate this bacteria into the wine, and it will kick off malolactic fermentation. Now, if you're wanting to undergo MLF, I recommend do not use potassium metabisulfite. Don't use KMBS because SO2 inhibits all microbial growth. Therefore, SO2 will inhibit lactic acid bacteria. You see, so we all add KMBS into wine, or we should be. In my opinion, you should add KMBS into wine. And if you're doing that, great. You're protecting your wine. Just know I'm inhibiting good bacteria as well. So just know what you're doing in terms of crush or after crush, or about this time of year. Some wines are going through MLF right now, or started a couple months ago or December. So just know if you're using KMBS, you're inhibiting all microbial growth. All right, so some wines for MLF. You're thinking, okay, I have these wines. What undergoes it? So really, nearly all reds undergo malolactic fermentation. It just seems to be the style and the taste and what people prefer. I like them as well. There's no wrong or right answer. It's just stylistically speaking. At the same time, if you have a red wine that's in a hot growing region and it was later harvest and you have very little malic acid, may not be recommended to undergo MLF, and I'll talk about that later. But across the board, mostly all reds undergo MLF. Very few white wines undergo MLF as well, funny enough. Well, I guess it's really not funny, but Chardonnay, Viognier are great candidates for this. I even did a Treminette that I underwent MLF. It was nice. But the reason whites usually don't is because that crispness. You see, malic acid is crisp, and think of Riesling, Gewürztraminer, maybe even a Pinot Grigio. You want a little bit of that crispness. Therefore, you don't want lactic acid, so you inhibit MLF. And again, just totally stylistic. There's no wrong or right. It's just kind of what's preferred and what's been trialed throughout the millennia. So just know that very few white wines undergo MLF, but a lot of red wines do. So again, just kind of stylistic. Red wines that undergo MLF in barrel will enhance a rounder, softer mouthfeel. So think about it. Lactic acid bacteria plus oak, plus some barrel aging, that's a creamy, velvety mouthfeel. Wonderful. At the same time, a crisp, light, floral white wine is also yum. That's also appealing too. So there's no wrong or right. Just know your style of wine, know what you're trying to make, and that'll advise you, should I take it through MLF? Should I not? Okay, so we're going to have a section here for a quick breather, but I know we'll just keep going until we hit that slide. So how to initiate malolactic fermentation. So let's say it's like, okay, I want to do this. I've got my wine through primary fermentation. I want to take it through MLF. How do I do that? Again, MLF can happen naturally. If cellar conditions are favorable, it'll kick off on its own. Or it can be inoculated with lactic acid bacteria. You can inoculate for MLF just as you inoculate for alcoholic fermentation. So the most popular lactic acid bacteria is probably Enococcus eni. It seems to be the best. A lot of people use it. A lot of commercial producers produce it. A lot of commercial labs produce Enococcus eni. So that's probably the most popular choice. There's also something called Pediococcus and Lactobacillus. All of these are gram-positive bacteria, if you know or care anything about that. Pediococcus is not the best one to use either, but at the same time, if you undergo it naturally, if you just let your wine go through MLF without inoculating, which is okay to do, you never know what bacteria you have in there, you see, unless you have a plating lab and you can identify them. So there's always a chance I'll have Pediococcus or Lactobacillus. Again, not wrong, but Enococcus, if you inoculate specifically with Enococcus, you'll know then, like, okay, the wine had Enococcus. That's probably the best one to use. Just FYI. So the wine needs to be warm enough to support lactic acid bacteria. So if you do want to initiate MLF, recommend slightly above room temperature, about 74 to 82 Fahrenheit. You don't want it too hot. You don't want it too cold. If the cellar is 65, it's hard for that bacteria to really grow and develop and carry on. So a cellar temperature of about 74 to 80 Fahrenheit is usually pretty ideal for malolactic fermentation. Now, cooler temperatures will delay or hinder lactic acid bacteria. At the same time, a cooler temperature will also drag out malolactic fermentation, you see. So if your cellar's maybe 68 Fahrenheit, that might be a good, I can drag out MLF for 6 weeks or 2 months and get a lot of diacetyl. You see, there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of artistic style in this. If you just want to churn through MLF, maybe turn the heat up to 85 and it'll just chug through it. But at the same time, alcohol will hinder growth at temperatures. We'll get on all this. There's a again, dense lecture. So next slide. So natural malolactic fermentation. So let's just say we're just going to let it go. I have a tank of wine. I just want to let it go through MLF. I'm not going to inoculate it. That's fine. A lot of people do that. There's no wrong answer here. But MLF will initiate naturally if cellar conditions are right. So if you just crank your cellar up to 70, 72 Fahrenheit, let the natural bacteria in that wine go through, it'll catalyze malic acid and lactic acid. It's a common practice across winemaking. A lot of people do it. The natural lab present, though, is usually mystery. Like I said, you could have lactobacillus in there. You could have pediococcus in there. You could also have enococcus in there. But when you inoculate with enococcus, you're guaranteeing, okay, I know this wine has enococcus, which is probably the best one to use. I say best, but it's a good one. Again, no wrong or right. Just know your wine can go through MLF naturally. So preparing bacteria for culture. So it's like, okay, I want to take it. My cellar conditions are right. Everything's good. I didn't use any KMBS. I'm at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, you can buy these commercial strains of Enococcusini for malolactic fermentation. They usually arrive in freeze-dried form, and the directions for preparation are usually differ by manufacturer. Some of this stuff you can just open the bag and dump it right in. You can open the bag and dump it right into the tank, and the bacteria will get to work, within the next day. Some manufacturers recommend rehydrating though. Some recommend, stirring in a little bit of warm water for 20 minutes, adding a little bit of wine into that, and then pouring it into the tank. They just differ by manufacturer recommendations. But essentially, if you want to induce MLF, you buy Enococcusini just like you would buy yeast, you see. And then when it arrives, you just dump it into your tank and let it go to work. Okay, quick questions real fast. We're about halfway through the presentation. Are there anybody who has any burning questions?
Hey, yeah, Aaron, this is Dan, Montreal. Hey, I've read some data state that the bacteria requires the nutrients present in the leads.
Yeah.
And so your one of your slides, I think it was the third or fourth slide, said avoid leads contact.
Yeah.
So what's your
take on it? Good.
thought?
I was going to get to nutrients in the ladder, where I have a slide or two about nutrients.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll hold that up then.
Oh, you're fine. No.
Yeah.
Yeah, the bacteria need a little bit of nutrients. A little lees you're going to get. If it's a young wine that just finished fermentation a month, 2 months ago, you're going to have a little bit of lees, and that's probably proper. That's okay. I'm just thinking if it's sitting on lees for like 6 months, that's
yeah. Okay.
that's probably not good. So a little lees will feed, and that's great. That's great. So I wouldn't recommend just keeping it on lees for half a year.
Yes. Okay, I got it. That makes sense.
Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you for the question. All right, we'll just keep rolling. Okay, so factors affecting successful malolactic fermentation. The 4 main ones: alcohol percentage, wine pH, temperature, and then again, sulfur dioxide. SO2, I also refer to as KMBS, potassium metabisulfite. It's all the same. So we'll start with alcohol. Now, these are not deal breakers. These are just favorable and unfavorable conditions. So if you have a wine and I'm talking a still wine that's after alcoholic fermentation, if you have a still wine that's below 13%, it's much more favorable for MLF. Wines above 14%, it can still happen. It's just less favorable. You see, you can still get a wine through MLF with 14-15%. It's just less favorable. Again, pH 3.3 to 3.6 is favorable, kind of ideal. A lesser pH usually inhibits kind of all microbial growth. If you have a 3.1 pH, it might not go through. But pH is above 3.6 will still go through MLF as well. These are just favorable ranges. Temperature, roughly 80 Fahrenheit, and take that a deviation of maybe plus minus 5. Favorable is about 74, 80 Fahrenheit. Unfavorable conditions, below 66 Fahrenheit. If you have a cold cellar, it's really hard for that. Or if you have a cold cellar, but a cold wine as well, it's harder for that bacteria to really start growing and developing. And then sulfur dioxide, both total and free. So this is something I've learned more and more about. It's not just free SO2 that will inhibit, but also total SO2. Now, I know that's kind of tough because some people add SO2 at crush, and I'll talk about that. But if you just absolutely want like almost a guaranteed below 30 ppm of total free SO2 is your best bet. Now, if you have free SO2, so if you have free sulfur dioxide like in suspension, above 55 ppm is really unfavorable. That's going to inhibit, everything. Obviously, free becomes bound over time, and if your free drops to maybe below 20, 15, you can probably get away with kicking off MLF, but your total is still there. Just total SO2 in wine, it's not said to bind with anything. It's already bound, but the bacteria don't seem to like it. I've just been reading about that. I don't know how true that is, but I just want to present what I've learned. And so some of you say, but what about the 50 ppm I added at crush? Eh, it's a common practice. When you harvest grapes, you dump 40, 50 ppm of KBS onto the grapes itself. Really, though, after crushing, after alcoholic fermentation, after pressing, a lot of that is probably lost in the must anyways. That 50 ppm that you added at crush is probably bound, especially after alcoholic fermentation. If your yeast have already churned through alcoholic fermentation and you haven't added any more KBS, then you're probably okay to induce with bacteria. But I just want to just to point that out. A lot of people add potassium metabisulfite at crush. By the time you get ready for MLF, it's probably already, lost in the must or bound up, and you should be okay. Okay, some more factors. The time of completion is either a few weeks to several months, again, depending on cellar conditions. A month, 4 weeks, 4 to 8 weeks is usually about average. If you have a warm temperature, clean wine, no KBS, it'll churn through very quickly. And that's not always a good thing, because if you want a lot of diacetyl production, if you want a lot of butteriness, you ought to think about dragging it out a little more. Maybe lower your cellar temperatures, take your time with it. There's no race, there's no real race here. But so temperature and alcohol together will affect bacteria performance. A bacteria will thrive in a juice at 85 Fahrenheit with no alcohol present. Now, if you have alcohol present, let's say you have a 15% wine at 85 Fahrenheit, it's much harder for the bacteria to grow and develop then at that point. So temperature and alcohol together really affect lab performance. Again, 13% is okay, lower the cellar temperature, and they won't cook so much because the bacteria will die if it's too hot. And then also alcohol kills bacteria as well. There's a reason we use rubbing alcohol to clean things. So just keep that present. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Temperature and alcohol together will affect lab performance. And I hit on this last slide. Bound SO2. Some say that bound SO2 can hinder lactic acid bacteria growth, which is what I've been reading. But it's always just good to know. Free and total together are important. Just keep track of how much KBS you've added. Keep track of when you're adding your lactic acid bacteria. Just go from there. And again, lactic acid bacteria is used for malolactic fermentation. I know some people are seeing this lab all over the place. That just stands for lactic acid bacteria. Okay, so monitoring MLF. Maybe you're the type you really want to know what's going on in your wine all the time. I want to know, is there lactic acid present? And as you should. So there's a couple ways to measure. Probably the best, and it's old school, but is paper chromatography. And I say best for industry purposes. I've used paper chromatography myself. It measures both malic acid and lactic acid present in solution. And it's the old school, you get your chromatography paper, you blot malic acid, you blot lactic acid, and then you just blot your wine. And if lactic acid appears on the paper and it appears in your wine, if the lactic acid appears in your wine on the paper, it is showing you have lactic acid present, which is what you want if you're inducing for MLF. And it's usually a direct correlation. The less malic acid you lose, the more lactic acid you gain, because that's the bacteria going to work. So paper chromatography is probably the best. And it's not hard to do. You can buy kits and it'll walk you through it. You just read the instructions on how to do it. And it usually takes about a day, I think, maybe 2 days for the result to show up. But it's a neat, fun trick, and it's a good way to keep your wines for sure gauge. It won't tell you quantitatively. It won't tell you how much acid is present. It will just tell you that acid is present. But again, it's probably the best thing to use in a cellar in my experience. Again, these enzyme color strips, these are cheap and quick and easy to use, but they usually max out at a 500 milligrams per liter. That's the only thing I've found. But what you can do if you have wine and you have these color strips and you're going through MLF, you can just keep testing your wine every week or every 2 weeks with these color strips. And you'll see if the color starts becoming lighter and lighter and lighter, you're losing malic acid. Thus, you can probably deduce that, okay, I'm gaining lactic acid, you see. So the enzyme strips are still a good thing to use if you just kind of can, figure a way to use it. If you're using these color strips and you have a lighter color every week, you're losing malic acid, you're gaining lactic acid, theoretically. And then again, high performance liquid chromatography, really only available at research labs. I think we have one here at OSU. It's just a big cool machine, really, but it's just impractical at a winery. But again, maybe if you're just dying to know what's my malic acid content, send it into the university. We can test it. Okay, so nutrient. Here we go. Malolactic fermentation nutrient. Lab primarily consume malic acid. That's the idea. These bacteria consume malic acid. Now, there's also amino acids, vitamins, and minerals that the lactic acid bacteria need as well for growth. And maybe they get some of this through leaves, as Dan was asking. So leaves can provide some minerals, can provide some vitamins. Ultimately, they consume malic acid, really. And some of these commercial, like private companies, develop these MLF nutrient. I've never used MLF nutrient in private industry. I've never used it. I've induced with bacteria, but I've never come behind and dumped in ML nutrient, you see, and I've never had a problem either. I'm not saying it's not guaranteed. I'm just saying I've never used nutrient in my experience. But they do need some. If you have a little bit of lees left over after alcoholic fermentation, that's probably proper. The yeast, I mean, the bacteria can probably gain nutrient from that. But then also cellulose is said to keep bacteria in suspension. Some of these private companies that make this nutrient will add a little bit of cellulose, which is just a plant, compound. And it's said to help keep the bacteria in suspension. I don't know. That's just what I've heard. So chemistry after MLF. And I think we have a few slides left. We're almost to the end, but malic acid is a strong acid that is twice as strong as lactic acid. If you want to dive heavier into the chemistry, so when malic acid is converted into lactic acid, the wine TA usually decreases. So your titratable acidity you'll lose acidity. Even though it's an acid for acid exchange, malic acid is twice as strong as lactic acid. And so the pH goes up, the TA goes down a little. You gain that softness, that butteriness, that creaminess, but you lose acidity, more. You lose TA. You do lose TA. So this is what I said earlier about having low malic acid and hot growing regions. If you have high pH wines, they're really not a good candidate for MLF. If your wine is already at a 3.9, I wouldn't really recommend taking a wine, especially not a 4.0 wine. If you have pH of 4.0, acidulate it, please. Well, you're the best. You're the winemaker. But a pH of 3.9, and then you go through MLF, any lactic acid, any malic acid that is present, you're going to lose and it's going to become lactic acid. But I don't know. There's a benefit there. Should I retain that malic acid? Should I retain that crispness? My pH is going to go up and my TA is going to decrease with MLF. Do I really want a higher pH wine at the cost of more butteriness? It's one of those dilemmas. See, there's no wrong or right. It's just a lot of stylistic, artistic. What are you trying to do? So again, it's a common problem, especially in Texas, where a lot of my experience comes from is in Texas, and this is an issue a lot of people face. It's like, okay, the wine came in at 4.0 grams per liter of total acid, and my pH is already 3.9. Do I really want to go through MLF? That's just a decision you have to make. Okay, so tank or barrel, there's no wrong or right. MLF can occur in either a tank or a barrel or even a carboy. If you have a glass carboy, you can go through MLF in a carboy. But again, it's common for barrels, at least in these big, huge wineries where they just don't have the tank space. They put it all in barrel and induce through barrel, and that's fine too. But again, the wine will likely need to be racked after ML completion. If you go straight from fermentation to barrel and then you induce MLF, you're going to get a lot of lees. So just make sure you rack after. And then once MLF is complete, I do recommend adding KMBS. So after your alcoholic fermentation is complete, and then after your malolactic fermentation is complete, there's no reason to take anything else through a microbial churn. So add KMBS after completion. But I just want to show this as well. So that's just a barrel to barrel racking. Lees settle out all the time naturally with time. So if you put wine in barrel and then you induce MLF in barrel, you'll form a little bit of lees afterwards. So it's always good to rack. All right, almost to the end. MLF increases microbial stability. This is kind of something else I learned recently. So Um, it said that malic acid to lactic acid. So it said that lactic acid makes red wine more stable, because there are good and bad microbes that feed on wine. You feed on malic acid, yeah, feed on wine. You see, so if no malic acid is present, you have less spoilage microbes in there. Just kind of a little thing you can add. I guess you can chalk up to MLF. That's more stable. I don't know how true that is. Maybe a little true, but I don't know of any microbes that actually feed on lactic acid. There are spoilage microbes that feed on malic acid. I don't know of any ones that feed on lactic acid. There may be some out there I just unaware of. But yeah, if your wine does go through MLF, it's a bit more stable microbially as well. Okay, so suppression. How do we suppress MLF? Let's say I don't want to do this. I don't want to go through MLF. I like my wine as is. It's a great wine. I don't want to risk anything. How do I suppress MLF? The quick answer is KMBS and low cellar temperatures. Crank your cellar down to below 65 Fahrenheit, and then also use potassium metabisulfite. Give it a good shot of 50 ppm. After primary fermentation, that will inhibit lactic acid bacteria. KMBS inhibits all microbial growth, including good bacteria. But if in this case, if you don't want this bacteria, say I don't want to go through MLF, cold cellar temperatures, cold tank temperatures, and then a lot of KMBS. Just give it a good shot, 50, 55 ppm. Higher alcohol wines as well. If you have wines above 15%, you're probably okay. It can still happen, but if you use all these together, cold cellar temperatures, KMBS, high alcohol, good chance it's not going to happen. And then low pH wine. I mean, I don't know. Again, white wine can be below 3.3, but I don't know of a red wine that should be below 3.3. But white wine usually doesn't go through MLF anyway. So yeah, the quick answer: cold cellar temperatures and potassium metabisulfite. And that brings us to the end. So I will stop recording and open us up to questions. Thank you much.